The threat only seemed to be growing. Germany was ahead, and only disinformation seems to be stopping them from using their own weapons. Japan remained an unknown, although concerning rumours and intelligence was coming out about them. The United States, in most respects, was disarmed and helpless in regards to the threat, possibly more impactful than the top-secret Manhattan Project. No scientific data existed to see how the US population would even respond to this threat. Quickly, a response was authorized and then created. It mobilized efforts to defend, understand, and then possibly utilize this threat. By the time the war had ended, the justification for its founding had only been strengthened, with evidence that both hostile nations had advanced projects underway. The nightmare of biological weaponry was becoming true. It's September 1950s, and Edward J. Nevins checks into a San Francisco hospital. He complains of chills, fever, and general malaise. The 75-year-old was a retired pipe fitter. 3 weeks later, he was dead of what doctors said was an infection of bacteria Serratia marsens. 12 others would also present to hospitals and be recorded as having the same infection. An unknown amount never presented, and their fate remains unknown. The problem with this tragic story is, despite public denials at the time, and continuing to this modern day, that what killed Mr. Nevin was not a natural event. The impacts of the actions taken in his death could still be with us today. I cannot tell you what Mr. Nevin was doing on his last healthy days, yet I can tell you what his city he was living and residing in was enduring before he walked into that hospital. The details, maps, weather reports, orders, all these documents were already created. A great deal of information was gathered on the attack of this American city. There was 2 deployed weapons. Both were believed to be harmless. No warning was given to the citizens of the Bay Area that this attack was taking place. No troops were mobilized to stop it. This is primarily because this attack was a test of what a biological pathogen would do if deployed on an American city. The only way that they believed they could achieve this data was by deploying it themselves. Once they deployed it, it proved difficult to measure, however, especially the one that would impact Mr. Nevin. That's because they couldn't actually see all of the deployed bacteria. However, they gathered enough information to regard the test as mostly successful. No checks or data was collected on the civilian population. This is due to the focus being on the spread, not the impact. It's meant to be harmless. At the time of deploying both these agents, they were believed to be harmless. However, unfortunately, it's turned out that this belief was misplaced, and that both are now regarded as hazardous to human health. There is always a risk, however, when deploying biological agents, no matter if they are harmless or not. These are living creatures, and they can evolve and adapt to the environment in unforeseen ways, and it is believed to this day that in the Bay Area, that is what has happened. Information on that is complicated, and I'm going to leave that for someone more scientifically literate to discuss. This is where I thought my investigation was going to end. I believed it'd be a sad, chilling story of how a government experimented on its own people, and it all went so horribly wrong. However, I wanted to make sure that I sourced this claim properly. There's a lot of people who would quite enjoy making sure that this didn't get out. They don't want people to believe that the government has the capability to test this on an unwilling population. But as I was digging, I found something quite concerning. This is only the more public and commonly discussed case that came out of those projects. Invasive testing has been done on the people in the name of biological security quite often in the United States. It's Minneapolis, 1953. The people are breathing in chemicals without even realizing it. Generators placed on the rooftop were putting out a mixture of zinc catamine sulfide into the air. A nearby school was exposed fully to this. News reports that did not include a denial by the US military. It appears that there was a devastating effect on those children. An increase in cancer, sterility, birth defects, and miscarriages higher than the general population have been reported following this exposure. Other tests took place in St. Louis and again in the same city. A vehicle was used to deploy the mixture around in neighbourhoods. The primary source that I was using listed numerous tests on public land that would have included the general public being exposed. It's beyond my ability to go through each of these limited tests and check what happened and if there was any victims. I encourage anyone with a passion to dig more into this and find out about each of these tests. It's become a trope of conspiracy theorists that aeroplanes have or are dumping chemicals on the people below. When I saw this claim included with a California deployment test source, I just assumed it was been included just to make a point without the right sourcing. That is what I believed, and when I was looking at the sources for this document, it then turned out that the sources had been destroyed by the Google Scholar search engine. I can't comment on why these sources have been removed, only to say that they have. However, I then ended up stumbling to a primary source that I can provide to every single listener. It will be in the description below, and I cite often from it. It's made the case crystal clear and closed and shut that the deployment from air of chemicals onto the people occurred. And with a change of search terms, I made headways into finding other sources talking about this. The potential for harm and mass exposure in this case is chilling. Let me just quote. In the largest test ever undertaken by the Chemical Corps to date, fluorescent microscopic particles of zinc calcium sulfide were sprayed from the aircraft to assess the way in which biological organisms might spread in the event of an attack of the United States. Operation LAC, large area coverage, was reported to have covered the United States from the Rockies to the Atlantic, from Canada to the Gulf of Mexico. The United States also wanted the ability to ship these weapons around the world and conducted tests where they loaded armed, primed weapons onto planes and then would be flown to numerous destinations. That meant soaring above the sky, there was biological and chemical weapons just waiting for an accident to happen. But there's an interesting comparison that we can also find from this time period. While subjecting the civilian population to experimental projects, even though they didn't believe there was harm, the military was conducting its own experiments on its own soldiers. This often focuses on SHAD, shipboard hazards and defense. However, I'm going to be talking about another operation by the name of Operation Whitecoat, both as stemming from a view demonstrated by the Armed Forces Medical Policy Council in 1953, which issued the following statement. Tests with stimulant have demonstrated the vulnerability of the United States to biological attack. No scientific data was available to assess the human vulnerability to biological agents. Page 117. So there was a frank discussion that then started about how they were going to collect this data. With war possibly looming on the horizon, they needed this now. So, human testing was permitted for military volunteers, and they had following rules. A. Voluntary consent is required. Written consent must be written and signed by the individual concerned. As you'll see, none of this was used on the people being exposed in these cities. B. No experimentation which could predictably lead to the death or permanent disabling injury will be investigated with the use of human volunteers. C. Proper medical supervision and the treatment capabilities will be immediately available to subjects. You have to wonder, if Mr. Nevin had this part allowed, what would have been his fate? D. Experimentation must be expected to yield fruitful results for the good of society, not available by other means. E. Experimentation should avoid all unnecessary physical and mental suffering. F. The degree of risk taken should never exceed the importance of the experiment or the expectable benefits from it. G. The volunteer may remove himself from the experiment at any stage if he feels that he has reached the limits of his physical or mental endurance. These were shaped into further policy that became the backbone of the operation. The difference between what they were willing to allow on their military personnel and what they were willing to allow on civilians is telling. It's a completely different view of consent for an individual, and was not something that any of the cities or regions tested were given. They were never really told about this until many years later. In conclusion, this, story from the past has lots of modern applications, some of which I will leave unsaid. One of the biggest concerns for me as I went through this process and was reading the old archives and old news reports and the primary source was how so many of these sources are being destroyed by the search engines at the modern day. Amazon is also part of this, although I did not use them personally. In this time of big tech, they're more than willing to destroy archives and records that don't fit with what they want or they believe have risk. The problem is that a lot of the original documents are not accessible to the general population or have been destroyed. That means when Google removes that source, or that source is removed from Amazon in a form of books and the libraries have got rid of them, there's no real way to be able to get it. Ebooks are a good thing here. They can keep a digital record of something, but when that digital record is not owned by the people, that raises concerns. But getting back to the story, we have to wonder how many unspoken victims of this testing there are. The US military used the civilian population of the United States in these irresponsible tests. With the fact that they had such a strong focus on ethics when it came to using it on military personnel in Operation Whitecoat, they demonstrated that they could think about ethics. It wasn't beyond their ability. In my mind, it's highly likely individuals have been killed due to the release of this bacteria, or has been a contributing factor for the releases that then followed. The fact that some people seem to focus on blind trust in government has not been demonstrated with historical evidence of how the government has acted in the past. Mistakes and bad actors can exist within the government, and they're more than happy to lie to you in the interest of what they believe is good for you. I'm sure that our modern day medical experts working for the government would never lie to the public for their good, or twist facts for the right understanding. This is Rebuilding Rome Audio. Thank you for listening.